It may be remarked, too, that Generals Branch and Ewell, following converging roads, met near Shady Grove Church about 3 p.m. No report appears to have been sent by the latter to General A. P. Hill, and although Branch a little later received a message to the effect that Hill had crossed the Chickahominy and was moving on Mechanicsville, the information was not passed on to Jackson. Neglect of these precautions made it impracticable to arrange a simultaneous attack, and cooperation depended solely on the judgment of Hill and Jackson. In the action which ensued on Beaver Dam Creek, there was no cooperation whatever. Hill attacked and was repulsed. Jackson had halted at Hundley's Corner, 3 miles distant from the battlefield. Had the latter come down on the Federal rear while Hill moved against their front, an easy success would in all probability have been the result. Nevertheless, the responsibility for Hill's defeat cannot be held to rest on Jackson's shoulders. On August 18, 1870, the Prussian Guards and the Saxon Army Corps were ordered to make a combined attack on the village of St. Private, the Guards moving against the front, the Saxons against the flank. When the order was issued, the two corps were not more than 2 miles apart. The tract of country which lay between them was perfectly open, the roads were free, and intercommunication seemed easy in the extreme. Yet despite their orders, despite the facilities of communication, the Guards advanced to the attack an hour and a half too soon, and from 6 o'clock to nearly 7, their shattered lines lay in front of the position, at the mercy of a vigorous counterstroke, without a single Saxon regiment coming to their aid. But the Saxons were not to blame. Their march had been unchecked, they had moved at speed. On their part there had been no hesitation, but on the part of the commander of the Guards there had been the same precipitation which led to the premature attack on the Federal position at Beaver Dam Creek. It was the impatience of General Hill, not the tardiness of Jackson, which was the cause of the Confederate repulse. We may now turn to the question whether Jackson was justified in not marching to the sound of the cannon. Referring to General Lee's orders, it will be seen that as soon as Longstreet and D.H. Hill had crossed the Chickahominy, the 4 divisions of the army were to move forward in communication with each other and drive the enemy from his position, Jackson in advance upon the left, turning Beaver Dam Creek and taking the direction of Cold Harbor. When Jackson reached Hundley's Corner and drove the Federal infantry behind the creek, the first thing to do, as his orders indicated, was to get in touch with the rest of the army. It was already near sunset. Between Hundley's Corner and Mechanicsville lay a dense forest, with no roads in the desired direction, and it was manifestly impossible, under ordinary conditions, to do more that evening than to establish connection. The combined movement against the enemy's position must be deferred till the morning. But the sound of battle to the southwest introduced a complication. "We distinctly heard," says Jackson, "the rapid and continued discharges of cannon." What did this fire portend? It might proceed, as was to be inferred from Lee's orders, from the heavy batteries on the Chickahominy covering Hill's passage. It might mean a Federal counterstroke on Hill's advanced guard, or possibly a premature attack on the part of the Confederates. General Whiting, according to his report, thought it indicated a severe battle. General Trimble, marching with Ewell, heard both musketry and artillery, and in his opinion the command should have moved forward, and whatever may have been Jackson's orders, it was undoubtedly his duty, if he believed a hot engagement was in progress, to have marched to the assistance of his colleagues. He could not help them by standing still. He might have rendered them invaluable aid by pressing the enemy in flank. But the question is, what inference did the cannonade convey to Jackson's mind? Was it of such a character as to leave no doubt that Hill was in close action, or might it be interpreted as the natural accompaniment of the passage of the Chickahominy? The evidence is conflicting. On the one hand, we have the evidence of Whiting and Trimble, both experienced soldiers. On the other, in addition to the indirect evidence of Jackson's inaction, we have the statement of Major Dabney. "We heard no signs," says the Chief of the Staff, "of combat on Beaver Dam Creek until a little while before sunset. The whole catastrophe took place in a few minutes about that time, and in any case our regiments, who had gone into bivouac, could not have been reassembled, formed up, and moved forward in time to be of any service. A night attack through the dense, pathless and unknown forest was quite impracticable. It seems probable, then, and the federal reports are to the same effect, that the firing was only really heavy for a very short period, and that Jackson believed it to be occasioned by Hill's passage of the Chickahominy and the rout of the Federals from Mechanicsville. Neither Trimble nor Whiting were aware that Lee's orders directed that the operation was to be covered by a heavy cannonade. Obeying orders very literally himself, Jackson found it difficult to believe that others did not do the same. He knew that the position he had taken up rendered the line of Beaver Dam Creek untenable by the Federals. They would never stand to fight on that line with a strong force established in their rear and menacing their communications, nor would they dare to deliver a counterstroke through the trackless woods. It might confidently be assumed, therefore, that they would fall back during the night, and that the Confederate advance would then be carried out in that concentrated formation which Lee's orders had dictated. Such, in all probability, was Jackson's view of the situation, and that Hill, in direct contravention of those orders, would venture on an isolated attack before that formation had been assumed, never for a moment crossed his mind. Hill, on the other hand, seems to have believed that if the Federals were not defeated on the evening of the 26th, they would make use of the respite, either to bring up reinforcements or to advance on Richmond by the opposite bank of the Chickahominy. It is not impossible that he thought the sound of his cannon would bring Jackson to his aid. That it would have been wiser to establish communication and to make certain of that aid before attacking, there can be no question. It was too late to defeat Porter the same evening. Nothing was to be gained by immediate attack, and much would be risked. The last assault, in which the heaviest losses were incurred, was made just as night fell. It was a sacrifice of life as unnecessary as that of the Prussian Guard before St. Private. At the same time, that General Hill did wrong in crossing the Chickahominy before he heard of his colleague's approach is not a fair accusation. To have lingered on the south bank would have been to leave Jackson to the tender mercies of the Federals should they turn against him in the forest. Moreover, it was Hill's task to open a passage for the remaining divisions, and if that passage had been deferred to a later hour, it is improbable that the Confederate army would have been concentrated on the north bank of the Chickahominy until the next morning. It must be admitted, too, that the situation in which Hill found himself, after crossing the river, was an exceedingly severe test of his self-control. His troops had driven in the Federal outposts. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery were retiring before his skirmishers. The noise of battle filled the air. From across the Chickahominy thundered the heavy guns, and his regiments were pressing forward with the impetuous ardour of young soldiers. If he yielded to the excitement of the moment, if eagerness for battle overpowered his judgment, if his brain refused to work calmly in the wild tumult of the conflict, he is hardly to be blamed. The patience which is capable of resisting the eagerness of the troops, the imperturbable judgment which, in the heat of action, weighs with deliberation the necessities of the moment, the clear vision which forecasts the result of every movement, these are rare qualities indeed. During the night, Porter fell back on Gaines's Mill. While the engagement at Beaver Dam Creek was still in progress, vast clouds of dust, rising above the forests to the northwest and north, had betrayed the approach of Jackson, and the reports of the cavalry left no doubt that he was threatening the Federal rear. The retreat was conducted in good order, a strong rear guard, reinforced by 2 batteries of horse artillery, holding the Confederates in check, and before morning a second position, east of Powhite Creek, and covering 2 bridges over the Chickahominy, Alexander's and Grapevine, was occupied by the 5th Army Corps. June 27th, 5 a.m. New Bridge was now uncovered, and Lee's army was in motion shortly after sunrise, Jackson crossing Beaver Dam Creek and moving due south in the direction of Walnut Grove Church. The enemy, however, had already passed eastward, and the Confederates, well concentrated and in hand, pushed forward in pursuit. A.P. Hill, with Longstreet on his right moving on Gaines's Mill, while Jackson, supported by D.H. Hill and with Stuart covering his left, marched by a more circuitous route to Old Cold Harbor. Near Walnut Grove Church, Jackson met the commander-in-chief, and it is recorded that the staff officers of the Valley Army, noting the eagerness displayed by General Lee's suite to get a glimpse of Stonewall, then for the first time realized the true character and magnitude of the Valley campaign. About noon, after a march of 7 miles, A.P. Hill's scouts reported that the Federals had halted behind Powhite Creek, the leading. Brigade was sent across the stream, which runs past Gaines's Mill, and pressing through the thick woods found the enemy in great strength on a ridge beyond. Hill formed his division for attack and opened fire with his 4 batteries. The enemy's guns, superior in number, at once responded, and the skirmish lines became actively engaged. The Confederate general, despite urgent messages from his subordinates requesting permission to attack, held his troops in hand, waiting till he should be supported, and for 2.5 hours the battle was no more than an affair of long bowls. The position held by the defence was emphatically one to impose caution on the assailants. To reach it, the Confederates were confined to 3 roads, 2 from Mechanicsville and 1 from Old Cold Harbor. These roads led each of them through a broad belt of forest, and then, passing through open fields, descended into a winding valley, from 500 to 1,000 yards in breadth. Rising near McGahee's house, due south of Old Cold Harbor, a sluggish creek bordered by swamps and thick timber, and cutting in places a deep channel, filtered through the valley to the Chickahominy. Beyond this stream rose an open and undulating plateau, admirably adapted to the movement of all arms, and with a slight command of the opposite ridge. On the plateau, facing west and north, the Federals were formed up. A fringe of trees and bushes along the crest gave cover and concealment to the troops. 60 feet below, winding darkly through the trees, the creek covered the whole front, and in the centre of the position, east of New Cold Harbor, the valley was completely filled with tangled wood. Towards Old Cold Harbor, the timber on the Confederate side of the ravine was denser than elsewhere. On the Federal left flank, the valley of the Chickahominy was open ground, but it was swept by heavy guns from the right bank of the river, and at this point the creek became an almost impassable swamp. Porter, who had been reinforced by 9,000 men under General Slocum, now commanded 3 divisions of infantry, 4 regiments of cavalry, and 22 batteries, a total of 36,000 officers and men. The morale of the troops had been strengthened by their easy victory of the previous day. Their commander had gained their confidence, their position had been partially entrenched, and they could be readily supported by way of Alexander's and Grapevine bridges from the south bank of the Chickahominy. The task before the Confederates, even with their superior numbers, was formidable in the extreme. The wooded ridge which encircled the position afforded scant room for artillery, and it was thus impracticable to prepare the attack by a preliminary bombardment. The ground over which the infantry must advance was completely swept by fire, and the centre and left were defended by 3 tiers of riflemen, the first sheltered by the steep banks of the creek, the second halfway up the bluff, covered by a breastwork, the third on the crest, occupying a line of shelter trenches, and the riflemen were supported by a dozen batteries of rifled guns. But Lee had few misgivings. In one respect, the Federal position seemed radically defective. The line of retreat on White House was exposed to attack from Old Cold Harbor. In fact, with Old Cold Harbor in possession of the Confederates, retreat could only be effected by one road north of the Chickahominy, that by Parker's Mill and Dispatch Station. And if this road were threatened, Porter, in order to cover it, would be compelled to bring over troops from his left and centre, or to prolong his line until it was weak everywhere. There was no great reason to fear that McClellan would send Porter heavy reinforcements. To do so, he would have to draw troops from his entrenchments on the south bank of the Chickahominy, and Magruder had been instructed to maintain a brisk demonstration against this portion of the line. It was probable that the Federal commander, with his exaggerated estimate of the numbers opposed to him, would be induced by this means to anticipate a general attack against his whole front, and would postpone moving his reserves until it was too late. While Hill was skirmishing with the Federals, Lee was anxiously awaiting intelligence of Jackson's arrival at Old Cold Harbor. Longstreet was already forming up for battle, and at 2:30 p.m. Hill's regiments were slipped to the attack. A fierce and sanguinary conflict now ensued. Emerging in well-ordered lines from the cover of the woods, the Confederates swept down the open slopes. Floundering in the swamps and struggling through the abatis which had been placed on the banks of the stream, they drove in the advanced line of hostile riflemen and strove gallantly to ascend the slope which lay beyond. But brigade after brigade, says General Porter, seemed almost to melt away before the concentrated fire of our artillery and infantry. Yet others pressed on, followed by supports daring and brave as their predecessors, despite their heavy losses and the disheartening effect of having to clamber over many of their disabled and dead, and to meet their surviving comrades rushing back in great disorder from the deadly contest. For over an hour, Hill fought on without support. There were no signs of Jackson, and Longstreet, whom it was not intended to employ until Jackson's appearance should have caused the Federals to denude their left, was then sent in to save the day. As on the previous day, the Confederate attack had failed in combination. Jackson's march had been again delayed. The direct road from Walnut Grove Church to Old Cold Harbor, leading through the forest, was found to be obstructed by felled timber and defended by sharpshooters, and to save time, Jackson's division struck off into the road by Bethesda Church. This threw it in rear of D.H. Hill, and it was near 2 p.m. when the latter's advanced guard reached the tavern at the Old Cold Harbor crossroads. No harm, however, had been done. A.P. Hill did not attack till half an hour later. But when he advanced, there came no response from the left. A battery of D.H. Hill's division was brought into action, but was soon silenced, and beyond this insignificant demonstration the Army of the Valley made no endeavour to join the battle. The brigades were halted by the roadside. Away to the right, above the intervening forest, rolled the roar of battle, the crash of shells and the din of musketry, but no orders were given for the advance. Nor had Jackson's arrival produced the slightest consternation in the Federal ranks. Although from his position at Cold Harbor he seriously threatened their line of retreat to the White House, they had neither denuded their left nor brought up their reserves. Where he was now established, he was actually nearer White House than any portion of Porter's Army Corps, and yet that general apparently accepted the situation with equanimity. Lee had anticipated that Jackson's approach would cause the enemy to prolong their front in order to cover their line of retreat to the White House, and so weaken that part of the position which was to be attacked by Longstreet, and Jackson had been ordered to draw up his troops so as to meet such a contingency. Hoping, he says in his report, that Generals A.P. Hill and Longstreet would soon drive the Federals towards me, I directed General D.H. Hill to move his division to the left of the wood, so as to leave between him and the wood on the right an open space, across which I hoped that the enemy would be driven. But Lee was deceived. The Federal line of retreat ran not to the White House, but over Grapevine Bridge. McClellan had for some time foreseen that he might be compelled to abandon the York River Railway, and directly he suspected that Jackson was marching to Richmond, had begun to transfer his line of operations from the York to the James, and his base of supply from the White House to Harrison's Landing. So vast is the amount of stores necessary for the subsistence, health, and armament of a host like McClellan's that a change of base is an operation which can only be effected under the most favourable circumstances. It is evident, then, that the possibility of the enemy shifting his line of operations to the James, abandoning the York River Railroad, might easily have escaped the penetration of either Lee or Jackson. They were not behind the scenes of the federal administrative system. They were not aware of the money, labour, and ingenuity which had been lavished on the business of supply. They had not seen with their own eyes the fleet of 400 transports which covered the reaches of the York. They had not yet realised the enormous advantage which an army derives from the command of the sea. Nor were they enlightened by the calmness with which their immediate adversaries on the field of battle regarded Jackson's possession of Old Cold Harbor. Still, one fact was manifest. The Federals showed no disposition whatever to weaken or change their position, and it was clear that the success was not to be attained by mere manoeuvre. Lee, seeing Hill's division roughly handled, ordered Longstreet forward, while Jackson, judging from the sound and direction of the firing that the original plan had failed, struck in with vigour. Opposed to him was Sykes's division of regulars, supported by 18 guns, afterwards increased to 24, and in the men of the United States Army the Valley soldiers met a stubborn foe. The position, moreover, occupied by Sykes possessed every advantage which a defender could desire. Manned even by troops of inferior metal, it might well have proved impregnable. The valley was wider than further west, and 1,000 yards intervened between the opposing ridges. From either crest, the cornfields sloped gently to the marshy sources of the creek, hidden by tall timber and dense undergrowth. The right and rear of the position were protected by a second stream, running south to the Chickahominy, and winding through a swamp which Stuart, posted on Jackson's left, pronounced impassable for horsemen. Between the headwaters of these two streams rose the spur on which stands McGeehee's house, facing the road from Old Cold Harbour and completely commanding the country to the north and northeast. The flank, therefore, was well secured. The front was strong, with a wide field of fire. The Confederate artillery, even if it could make its way through the thick woods on the opposite crest, would have to unlimber under fire at effective range, and the marsh below, with its tangled undergrowth and abatis, could hardly fail to throw the attacking infantry into disorder. Along the whole of Sykes' line, only 2 weak points were apparent. On his left, as already described, a broad tract of woodland covering nearly the whole valley and climbing far up the slope on the Federal side afforded a covered approach from one crest to the other. On his right, a plantation of young pines skirted the crest of McGeehee's Hill and ran for some distance down the slope. Under shelter of the timber, it was possible that the Confederate infantry might mass for the assault. But once in the open, unaided by artillery, their further progress would be difficult. Under ordinary circumstances, a thorough reconnaissance, followed by a carefully planned attack, would have been the natural course of the assailant. The very strength of the position was in favour of the Confederates. The creek which covered the whole front rendered a counterstroke impracticable and facilitated a flank attack. Holding the right bank of the creek with a portion of his force, Jackson might have thrown the remainder against McGeehee's Hill, and working round the flank have repeated the tactics of Kernstown, Winchester, and Port Republic. But the situation permitted no delay. A.P. Hill was hard pressed. The sun was already sinking. McClellan's reserves might be coming up, and if the battle was to be won, it must be won by direct attack. There was no time for further reconnaissance, no time for manoeuvre. Jackson's dispositions were soon made. D.H. Hill, eastward of the Old Cold Harbour Road, was to advance against McGeehee's Hill, overlapping, if possible, the enemy's line. Ewell was to strike in on Hill's right, moving through the tract of woodland. Lawton, Whiting, and Winder, in the order named, were to fill the gap between Ewell's right and the left of A.P. Hill's division, and the artillery was ordered into position opposite McGeehee's Hill. D.H. Hill, already in advance, was the first to move. Pressing forward from the woods under a heavy fire of artillery, his 5 brigades, the greater part in first line, descended to the creek, already occupied by his skirmishers. In passing through the marshy thickets, where the Federal shells were bursting on every hand, the confusion became great. The brigades crossed each other's march. Regiments lost their brigades, and companies their regiments. At one point the line was so densely crowded that whole regiments were forced to the rear. At others there were wide intervals, and effective supervision became impossible. Along the edge of the timber the fire was fierce, for the Union regulars were distant no more than 400 yards. The smoke rolled heavily through the thickets, and on the right and centre, where the fight was hottest, the impetuosity of both officers and men carried them forward up the slope. An attempt to deliver a charge with the whole line failed in combination, and such portion of the division as advanced, scourged by both musketry and artillery, fell back before the fire of the unshaken Federals. In the wood to the right, Ewell met with even fiercer opposition. So hastily had the Confederate line been formed, and so difficult was it for the brigades to maintain touch and direction in the thick covert, that gaps soon opened along the front, and of these gaps, directly the Southerners gained the edge of the timber, the Northern brigadiers took quick advantage. Not content with merely holding their ground, the regular regiments, changing front so as to strike the flanks of the attack, came forward with the bayonet, and a vigorous counterstroke, delivered by 5 battalions, drove Ewell across the swamp. Part of Trimble's brigade still held on in the wood, fighting fiercely. But the Louisiana regiments were demoralized, and there were no supports on which they might have rallied. Jackson, when he ordered Hill to the front, had sent verbal instructions, always dangerous, for the remainder of his troops to move forward in line of battle. The young staff officer to whom these instructions were entrusted, misunderstanding the intentions of his chief, communicated the message to the brigadiers with the addition that they were to await further orders before engaging the enemy. Partly for this reason, and partly because the rear regiments of his division had lost touch with the leading brigades, Ewell was left without assistance. For some time the error was undiscovered. Jackson grew anxious. From his station near Old Cold Harbor little could be seen of the Confederate troops. On the ridge beyond the valley the dark lines of the enemy's infantry were visible amongst the trees, with their well-served batteries on the crests above. But in the valley immediately beneath, and as well as in the forest to the right front, the dense smoke and the denser timber hid the progress of the fight. Yet the sustained fire was a sure token that the enemy still held his own, and for the first time and the last his staff beheld their leader riding restlessly to and fro, and heard his orders given in a tone which betrayed the storm within. Unconscious, says Dabney, that his veteran brigades were but now reaching the ridge of battle, he supposed that all his strength had been put forth, and, what had never happened before, the enemy was not crushed. Fortunately, the error of the aide-de-camp had already been corrected by the vigilance of the chief of the staff, and the remainder of the Valley Army was coming up. Their entry into battle was not in accordance with the intentions of their chief. Whiting should have come in on Ewell's right, Lawton on the right of Whiting, and Jackson's division on the right of Lawton. Whiting led the way, but he had advanced only a short distance through the woods when he was met by Lee, who directed him to support General A.P. Hill. The brigades of Law and of Hood were therefore diverted to the right, and deploying on either side of the Gaines Mill Road, were ordered to assault the commanding bluff which marked the angle of the Federal position. Lawton's Georgians, 3,500 strong, moved to the support of Ewell. Cunningham and Fulkerson of Winder's division, losing direction in the thickets, eventually sustained the attack of Longstreet, and the Stonewall Brigade reinforced the shattered ranks of D.H. Hill. Yet the attack was strong, and in front of Old Cold Harbor 6 batteries had forced their way through the forest. As this long line of guns covered McGeehee's Hill with a storm of shells, and the louder crash of musketry told him that his lagging brigades were coming into line, Jackson sent his last orders to his divisional commanders. "Tell them," he said, "this affair must hang in suspense no longer. Let them sweep the field with the bayonet." But there was no need for further urging. Before the messengers arrived, the Confederate infantry, in every quarter of the battlefield, swept forward from the woods, and a vast wave of men converged upon the plateau. Lee, almost at the same moment as Jackson, had given the word for a general advance. As the supports came thronging up, the shout was carried down the line, "The Valley men are here!" And with the cry of "Stonewall Jackson" for their slogan, the Southern army dashed across the deep ravine. Whiting, with the 8 regiments of Hood and Law, none of which had been yet engaged, charged impetuously against the centre. The brigades of A.P. Hill, spent with fighting but clinging stubbornly to their ground, found strength for a final effort. Longstreet threw in his last reserve against the triple line which had already decimated his division. Lawton's Georgians bore back the regulars. D.H. Hill, despite the fire of the batteries on McGeehee's Hill, which, disregarding the shells of Jackson's massed artillery, turned with canister on the advancing infantry. made good his footing on the ridge, and as the sun, low on the horizon, loomed blood-red through the murky atmosphere, the Confederate colours waved along the line of abandoned breastworks. As the Federals retreated, knots of brave men, hastily collected by officers of all ranks, still offered a fierce resistance and, supported by the batteries, inflicted terrible losses on the crowded masses which swarmed up from the ravine. But the majority of the infantry, without ammunition and with few officers, streamed in disorder to the rear. For a time the Federal gunners stood manfully to their work. Porter's reserve artillery, drawn up midway across the upland, offered a rallying point to the retreating infantry. 3 small squadrons of the 5th United States Cavalry made a gallant but useless charge, in which out of 7 officers, 6 fell. And on the extreme right, the division of regulars, supported by a brigade of volunteers, fell back fighting to a second line. As at Bull Run, the disciplined soldiers alone showed a solid front amid the throng of fugitives. Not a foot of ground had they yielded till their left was exposed by the rout of the remainder. Of the 4 batteries which supported them, only 2 guns were lost, and on their second position they made a determined effort to restore the fight. But their stubborn valour availed nothing against the superior numbers which Lee's fine strategy had concentrated on the field of battle. Where the first breach was made in the Federal line is a matter of dispute. Longstreet's men made a magnificent charge on the right, and D.H. Hill claimed to have turned the flank of the regulars. But it is abundantly evident that the advent of Jackson's fresh troops and the vigour of their assault broke down the resistance of the Federals. When the final attack developed, and along the whole front masses of determined men in overwhelming numbers dashed against the breastworks, Porter's troops were well nigh exhausted, and not a single regiment remained in reserve. Against the very centre of his line, the attack was pushed home by Whiting's men with extraordinary resolution. His 2 brigades, marching abreast, were formed in 2 lines, each about 2,000 strong. Riding along the front before they left the wood, the general had enjoined his men to charge without a halt, in double time, and without firing. Had these orders, says General Law, not been strictly obeyed, the assault would have been a failure. No troops could have stood long under the withering storm of lead and iron that beat in their faces as they became fully exposed to view from the Federal line. The assault was met with a courage that was equally admirable. But the Confederate second line reinforced the first at exactly the right moment, driving it irresistibly forward. And the Federal regiments, which had been hard-pressed through a long summer afternoon and had become scattered in the thickets, were ill-matched with the solid and ordered ranks of brigades which had not yet fired a shot. It was apparently at this point that the Southerners first set foot on the plateau, and sweeping over the entrenchments, outflanked the brigades which still held out to right and left, and compelled them to fall back. Inspired by his soldierly enthusiasm for a gallant deed, Jackson himself has left us a vivid description of the successful charge. "On my extreme right," he says in his report, General Whiting advanced his division through the dense forest and swamp, emerging from the wood into the field near the public road, and at the head of the deep ravine which covered the enemy's left. Advancing thence through a number of retreating and disordered regiments, he came within range of the enemy's fire, who, concealed in an open wood and protected by breastworks, poured a destructive fire for a quarter of a mile into his advancing line, under which many brave officers and men fell. Dashing on with unfaltering step in the face of these murderous discharges of canister and musketry, General Hood and Colonel Law, at the heads of their respective brigades, rushed to the charge with a yell. Moving down a precipitous ravine, leaping ditch and stream, clambering up a difficult ascent, and exposed to an incessant and deadly fire from the entrenchments, those brave and determined men pressed forward, driving the enemy from his well-selected and fortified position. In this charge, in which upwards of 1,000 men fell killed and wounded before the fire of the enemy, and in which 14 pieces of artillery and nearly a whole regiment were captured, the 4th Texas, under the lead of General Hood, was the first to pierce these strongholds and seize the guns. How fiercely the Northern troops had battled is told in the outspoken reports of the Confederate generals. Before Jackson's reserves were thrown in, the first line of the Confederate attack had been exceedingly roughly handled. A.P. Hill's division had done good work in preparing the way for Whiting's assault, but a portion of his troops had become demoralized. Ewell's regiments met the same fate, and we read of them skulking from the front in a shameful manner, the woods on our left and rear full of troops in safe cover from which they never stirred, of regiment after regiment rushing back in utter disorder, of others which it was impossible to rally, and of troops retiring in confusion who cried out to the reinforcements, "You need not go in, we are whipped, we can't do anything." It is only fair to say that the reinforcements replied, "Get out of our way, we will show you how to do it." But it is not to be disguised that the Confederates at one time came near defeat. With another division in reserve at the critical moment, Porter might have maintained his line unbroken. His troops, had they been supported, were still capable of resistance. McClellan, however, up to the time the battle was lost, had sent but one division, Slocum's, and 2 batteries to Porter's support. 66,000 Federals on the south bank of the Chickahominy had been held in their entrenchments throughout the day by the demonstrations of 28,000 Confederates. Intent on saving his trains, on securing his retreat to the River James, and utterly regardless of the chances which fortune offered, the young Napoleon had allowed his rearguard to be overwhelmed. He was not seen on the plateau which his devoted troops so well defended, nor even at the advanced posts on the further bank of the Chickahominy. So convinced was he of the accuracy of the information furnished by his detective staff that he never dreamt of testing the enemy's numbers by his own eyesight. Had he watched the development of Lee's attack, noted the small number of his batteries, the long delay in the advance of the supports, the narrow front of his line of battle, he would have discovered that the Confederate strength had been greatly exaggerated. There were moments, too, during the fight, when a strong counterstroke, made by fresh troops, would have placed Lee's army in the greatest peril. But a general who thinks only of holding his lines and not of annihilating the enemy is a poor tactician, and McClellan's lack of enterprise, which Lee had so accurately gauged, may be inferred from his telegram to Lincoln. "I have lost this battle because my force is too small." Porter was perhaps a more than sufficient substitute for the commander-in-chief. His tactics, as fighting a waiting battle, had been admirable, and, when his front was broken, strongly and with cool judgment, he sought to hold back the enemy and cover the bridges. The line of batteries he established across the plateau, 80 guns in all, proved at first an effective barrier. But the retreat of the infantry, the waning light, and the general dissolution of all order had its effect upon the gunners. When the remnant of the 5th Cavalry was borne back in flight, the greater part of the batteries had already limbered up, and over the bare surface of the upland the Confederate infantry, shooting down the terrified teams, rushed forward in hot pursuit. 22 guns, with a large number of ammunition wagons, were captured on the field, prisoners surrendered at every step, and the fight surged onward towards the bridges. But between the bridges and the battlefield, on the slopes falling to the Chickahominy, the dark forest covered the retreat of the routed army. Night had already fallen. The confusion in the ranks of the Confederates was extreme, and it was impossible to distinguish friend from foe. All direction had been lost. None knew the bearings of the bridges, or whether the Federals were retreating east or south. Regiments had already been exposed to the fire of their comrades, and in front of the forest a perceptible hesitation seized on both officers and men. At this moment, in front of D.H. Hill's division, which was advancing by the road leading directly to the bridges, loud cheers were heard. It was clear that Federal reinforcements had arrived. The general ordered his troops to halt, and along the whole line the forward movement came quickly to a standstill. 2 brigades, French's and Meagher's, tardily sent over by McClellan, had arrived in time to stave off a terrible disaster. Pushing through the mass of fugitives with the bayonet, these fine troops had crossed the bridge, passed through the woods, and formed a line on the southern crest of the plateau. Joining the regulars, who still presented a stubborn front, they opened a heavy fire, and under cover of their steadfast lines, Porter's troops withdrew across the river. Notwithstanding this strong reinforcement of 5,000 or 6,000 fresh troops, it is by no means impossible, had the Confederates pushed resolutely forward, that the victory would have been far more complete. Winder, says General D.H. Hill, thought that we ought to pursue into the woods on the right of the Grapevine Bridge Road, but not knowing the position of our friends, nor what Federal reserves might be awaiting us in the woods, I thought it advisable not to move on. General Lawton concurred with me. I had no artillery to shell the woods in front, as mine had not got through the swamp. Winder, he adds, was right. Even a show of pressure must have been attended with great result. Had Jackson been at hand, the pressure would in all probability have been applied. The contagion of defeat soon spreads, and whatever reserves a flying enemy may possess, if they are vigorously attacked whilst the fugitives are still passing through their ranks, history tells us, however bold their front, that unless they are entrenched, their resistance is seldom long protracted. More than all, when night has fallen on the field, and prevents all estimate of the strength of the attack, a resolute advance has peculiar chances of success. But when his advanced line halted, Jackson was not yet up, and before he arrived the impetus of victory had died away. The Federal reserves were deployed in a strong position, and the opportunity had already passed. It is no time when the tide of victory bears him forward for a general to take counsel of his fears. It is no time to count numbers or to conjure up the phantoms of possible reserves. The sea itself is not more irresistible than an army which has stormed a strong position and which has attained, in so doing, the exhilarating consciousness of superior courage. Had Stuart, with his 2,000 horsemen, followed up the pursuit towards the bridges, the Federal reserves might have been swept away in panic. But Stuart, in common with Lee and Jackson, expected that the enemy would endeavour to reach the White House, and when he saw that their lines were breaking, he had dashed down a lane which led to the river road, about 3 miles distant. When he reached that point, darkness had already fallen, and finding no traces of the enemy, he had returned to Old Cold Harbour. On the night of the battle, the Confederates remained where the issue of the fight had found them. Across the Grapevine Road, the pickets of the hostile forces were in close proximity, and men of both sides, in search of water or carrying messages, strayed within the enemy's lines. Jackson himself, it is said, came near capture. Riding forward in the darkness, attended by only a few staff officers, he suddenly found himself in the presence of a Federal picket. Judging rightly of the enemy's morale, he set spurs to his horse, and charging into the midst, ordered them to lay down their arms, and 15 or 20 prisoners, marching to the rear, amused the troops they met on the march by loudly proclaiming that they had the honour of being captured by Stonewall Jackson. These men were not without companions. 2,830 Federals were reported either captured or missing, and while some of those were probably among the dead, a large proportion found their way to Richmond. 4,000, moreover, had fallen on the field of battle. The Confederate casualties were even a clearer proof of the severity of the fighting. So far as can be ascertained, 8,000 officers and men were killed or wounded. Longstreet, 1,850. A.P. Hill, 2,450. Jackson, 3,700. Jackson's losses were distributed as follows: Jackson's own division, 600. Ewell, 650. Whiting, 1,020. D.H. Hill, 1,430. The regimental losses, in several instances, were exceptionally severe. Of the 4th Texas of Hood's brigade, the first to pierce the Federal line, there fell 20 officers and 230 men. The 20th North Carolina of D.H. Hill's division, which charged the batteries on McGeehee's Hill, lost 70 killed and 200 wounded. Of the same division, the 3rd Alabama lost 200, and the 12th North Carolina 212, while 2 of Lawton's regiments, the 31st and the 38th Georgia, had each a casualty list of 170. Almost every single regiment north of the Chickahominy took part in the action. The cavalry did nothing, but at least 48,000 infantry were engaged, and 17 batteries are mentioned in the reports as having participated in the battle. Chapter 14. The 7 Days. Fraser's Farm and Malvern Hill, June 28, 1862. The Battle of Gaines' Mill, although the assailants suffered heavier losses than they inflicted, was a long step towards accomplishing the deliverance of Richmond. One of McClellan's 5 army corps had been disposed of. A heavy blow had been struck at the morale of his whole army, and his communications with the White House and the Pamunkey were at the mercy of his enemies. Still, the Confederate outlook was not altogether clear. It is one thing to win a victory, but another to make such use of it as to annihilate the enemy. Porter's defeat was but a beginning of operations, and although Lee was convinced that McClellan would retreat, he was by no means so certain that his escape could be prevented. Yet this was essential. If the Federal army were suffered to fall back without incurring further loss, it would be rapidly reinforced from Washington, and resuming the advance, this time with still larger numbers, might render Gaines's Mill a barren victory. How to compass the destruction of McClellan's host was the problem that now confronted the Confederate leader. And before a plan could be devised, it was necessary to ascertain the direction of the retreat. On the morning of June 28th, it was found that no formed body of Federal troops remained north of the Chickahominy. French, Meagher, and Sykes, the regulars forming the rear guard, had fallen back during the night and destroyed the bridges. Hundreds of stragglers were picked up, and one of the most gallant of the northern brigadiers was found asleep in the woods, unaware that his troops had crossed the stream. No further fighting was to be expected on the plateau, but it was possible that the enemy might still endeavour to preserve his communications, marching by the south bank of the river and recrossing by the railway and Bottom's bridges. Stuart, supported by Ewell, was at once ordered to seize the former, but when the cavalry reached Dispatch Station, a small Federal detachment retreated to the south bank of the Chickahominy and fired the timbers. Meanwhile, from the field of Gaines' Mill, long columns of dust, rising above the forests to the south, had been descried, showing that the enemy was in motion, and when the news came in that the railway bridge had been destroyed and that the line itself was unprotected, it was at once evident that McClellan had abandoned his communications with White House. This was valuable information, but still the line of retreat had not yet been ascertained. The Federals might retreat to some point on the James River, due south, there meeting their transports, or they might march down the peninsula to Yorktown and Fortress Monroe. In the latter event, says Lee, it was necessary that our troops should continue on the north bank of the river, and until the intention of General McClellan was discovered, it was deemed injudicious to change their disposition. Ewell was therefore ordered to proceed to Bottom's Bridge, and the cavalry to watch the bridges below. No certain indications of a retreat to the James River were discovered by our forces, Magruder, on the south side of the Chickahominy, and late in the afternoon, the enemy's works were reported to be fully manned. Below, south of the enemy's works, the country was densely wooded and intersected by impassable swamps, at once concealing his movements and precluding reconnaissances except by the regular roads, all of which were strongly guarded. The bridges over the Chickahominy in rear of the enemy were destroyed, and their reconstruction impracticable in the presence of his whole army and powerful batteries. We were therefore compelled to wait until his purpose should be developed. During the day, therefore, the Confederate army remained on the battlefield, waiting for the game to bolt. In the evening, however, signs of a general movement were reported in the rear of the entrenchments at 7 Pines, and as nothing had been observed by the cavalry on the Chickahominy, Lee, rightly concluding that McClellan was retreating to the James, issued orders for the pursuit to be taken up the next morning. But to intercept the enemy before he could fortify a position, covered by the fire of his gunboats, on the banks of the James, was a difficult operation. The situation demanded rapid marching, close concert, and delicate manoeuvres. The Confederate army was in the rear of the Federals, and separated from them by the Chickahominy, and to reach the James, McClellan had only 14 miles to cover. But the country over which he had to pass was still more intricate and traversed by even fewer roads than the district which had hitherto been the theatre of operations. Across his line of march ran the White Oak Swamp, bordered by thick woods and a wide morass, and crossed by only one bridge. If he could transfer his whole army south of this stream, without molestation, he would find himself within 6 miles of his gunboats, and as his left flank was already resting on the swamp, it was not easy for Lee's army to prevent his passage. But 28,000 Confederates were already south of the Chickahominy, on the flank of McClellan's line of march, and it was certainly possible that this force might detain the Federals until A.P. Hill, Longstreet, and Jackson should come up. Magruder and Huger were therefore ordered to advance early on the 29th, and moving, the one by the Williamsburg, the other by the Charles City Road, to strike the enemy in flank. A.P. Hill and Longstreet, recrossing the Chickahominy at New Bridge, were to march by the Darbytown Road in the direction of Charles City Crossroads, thus turning the headwaters of the White Oak Swamp and threatening the Federal rear. Jackson, crossing Grapevine Bridge, was to move down the south bank of the Chickahominy, cross the swamp by the bridge, and force his way to the Long Bridge Road. The Confederate army was thus divided into 4 columns, moving by 4 different roads. Each column at starting was several miles distant from the others, and a junction was to be made upon the field of battle. The cavalry, moreover, with the exception of a few squadrons, was far away upon the left, pursuing a large detachment which had been observed on the road to the White House. McClellan had undoubtedly resolved on a most hazardous manoeuvre. His supply and ammunition train consisted of over 5,000 wagons. He was encumbered with the heavy guns of the siege artillery. He had with him more than 50 field batteries. His army was still 95,000 strong, and this unwieldy multitude of men, horses, and vehicles had to be passed over White Oak Swamp, and then to continue its march across the front of a powerful and determined enemy. But Lee also was embarrassed by the nature of the country. If McClellan's movements were retarded by the woods, swamps, and indifferent roads, the same obstacles would interfere with the combination of the Confederate columns, and the pursuit depended for success on their close cooperation. June 29th. The first day's work was hardly promising. The risks of unconnected manoeuvres received abundant illustration. Magruder, late in the afternoon, struck the enemy's rearguard near Savage's Station, but was heavily repulsed by 2 Federal Army corps. Huger, called by Magruder to his assistance, turned aside from the road which had been assigned to him, and when he was recalled by an urgent message from Lee, advanced with the timidity which almost invariably besets the commander of an isolated force in the neighbourhood of a large army. Jackson, whose line of march led him directly on Savage's Station, was delayed until after nightfall by the necessity of rebuilding the Grapevine Bridge. Stuart had gone off to the White House, bent on the destruction of the enemy's supply depot. Longstreet and Hill encamped southwest of Charles City Crossroads, but saw nothing of the enemy. Holmes, with 6,500 men, crossed the James during the afternoon and encamped on the north bank, near Laurel Hill Church. During the night, the Federal rearguard fell back, destroying the bridge over White Oak Swamp, and although a large quantity of stores were either destroyed or abandoned, together with a hospital containing 2,500 wounded, the whole of McClellan's army, men, guns, and trains, effected the passage of this dangerous obstacle. June 30th. The next morning Longstreet, with Hill in support, moved forward, and found a Federal division in position near Glendale. Bringing his artillery into action, he held his infantry in hand until Huger should come up on his left and Jackson's guns be heard at White Oak Bridge. Holmes, followed by Magruder, was marching up the New Market Road to Malvern House, and when the sound of Jackson's artillery became audible to the northwards, Lee sent Longstreet forward to the attack. A sanguinary conflict on ground covered with heavy timber and cut up by deep ravines resulted in the Federals holding their ground till nightfall, and although many prisoners and several batteries were captured by the Confederates, McClellan, under cover of the darkness, made good his escape. The Battle of Glendale, or Fraser's Farm, was the crisis of the 7 days. Had Lee been able to concentrate his whole strength against the Federals, it is probable that McClellan would never have reached the James. But Longstreet and Hill fought unsupported. As the former very justly complained, 50,000 men were within hearing of the guns, but none came to cooperate, and against the 2 Confederate divisions fought the 3rd Federal Army Corps, reinforced by 3 divisions from the 2nd, 5th, and 6th. Huger's march on the Charles City Road was obstructed by felled trees. When he at last arrived in front of the enemy, he was held in check by 2 batteries, and he does not appear to have opened communication with either Lee or Longstreet. Magruder had been ordered to march down from Savage Station to the Darbytown Road, and there to await orders. At 4:30 p.m., he was ordered to move to Newmarket in support of Holmes. This order was soon countermanded, but he was unable to join Longstreet until the fight was over. Holmes was held in check by Porter's Army Corps, minus McCall's division, on Malvern Hill, and the cavalry, which might have been employed effectively against the enemy's left flank and rear, was still north of the Chickahominy, returning from a destructive but useless raid on the depot at the White House. Nor had the conduct of the battle been unaffected by the complicated nature of the general plan. Longstreet attacked alone, Hill being held back, in order to be fresh for the pursuit when Jackson and Huger should strike in. The attack was successful, and McCall's division, which had shared the defeat at Gaines's Mill, was driven from its position. But McCall was reinforced by other divisions. Longstreet was thrown onto the defensive by superior numbers, and when Hill was at length put in, it was with difficulty that the fierce counterblows of the Federals were beaten off. Jackson's failure to cooperate at White Oak Swamp. Jackson had been unable to participate in the conflict. When night fell, he was still north of the White Oak Swamp, 7 miles distant from his morning bivouac, and hardly a single infantryman in his command had pulled a trigger. According to his own report, his troops reached White Oak Bridge about noon. Here the enemy made a determined effort to retard our advance and thereby to prevent an immediate junction between General Longstreet and myself. We found the bridge destroyed, the ordinary place of crossing commanded by their batteries on the other side, and all approach to it barred by detachments of sharpshooters concealed in a dense wood close by. A heavy cannonading in front announced the engagement of General Longstreet at Fraser's Farm, Glendale, and made me eager to press forward. But the marshy character of the soil, the destruction of the bridge over the marsh and creek, and the strong position of the enemy for defending the passage, prevented my advancing until the following morning. Such are Jackson's reasons for his failure to cooperate with Longstreet. It is clear that he was perfectly aware of the importance of the part he was expected to play, and he used every means which suggested itself as practicable to force a crossing. The 2nd Virginia Cavalry under Colonel Munford had now joined him from the valley, and their commanding officer bears witness that Jackson showed no lack of energy. When I left the general on the preceding evening, he ordered me to be at the crossroads, 5 miles from White Oak Bridge, at sunrise the next morning, ready to move in advance of his troops. The worst thunderstorm came up about night I ever was in, and in that thickly wooded country one could not see his horse's ears. My command scattered in the storm, and I do not suppose that any officer had a rougher time in any one night than I had to endure. When the first grey dawn appeared, I started off my adjutant and officers to bring up the scattered regiment. But at sunrise I had not more than 50 men, and I was half a mile from the crossroads. When I arrived, to my horror, there sat Jackson waiting for me. He was in a bad humour, and said, "Colonel, my orders to you were to be here at sunrise." I explained my situation, telling him that we had no provisions, and that the storm and the dark night had conspired against me. When I got through, he replied, "Yes, sir. But, Colonel, I ordered you to be here at sunrise. Move on with your regiment. If you meet the enemy, drive in his pickets, and if you want artillery, Colonel Crutchfield will furnish you." I started on with my little handful of men. As others came straggling on to join me, Jackson noticed it, and sent 2 couriers to inform me that my men were straggling badly. I rode back and went over the same story, hoping that he would be impressed with my difficulties. He listened to me, but replied as before, "Yes, sir. But I ordered you to be here at sunrise, and I have been waiting for you for a quarter of an hour." Seeing that he was in a peculiar mood, I determined to make the best of my trouble, sent my adjutant back, and made him halt the stragglers and form my men as they came up, and with what I had, determined to give him no cause for complaint. When we came upon the enemy's picket, we charged and pushed the picket every step of the way into their camp, where there were a large number of wounded and many stores. It was done so rapidly that the enemy's battery on the other side of White Oak Swamp could not fire on us without endangering their own friends. When Jackson came up, he was smiling, and he at once, shortly after noon, ordered Colonel Crutchfield to bring up the artillery, and very soon the batteries were at work. After the lapse of about an hour, my regiment had assembled, and while our batteries were shelling those of the enemy, Jackson sent for me and said, "Colonel, move your regiment over the creek and secure those guns. I will ride with you to the swamp." When we reached the crossing, we found that the enemy had torn up the bridge and had thrown the timbers into the stream, forming a tangled mass which seemed to prohibit a crossing. I said to General Jackson that I did not think that we could cross. He looked at me, waved his hand, and replied, "Yes, Colonel, try it." In we went and floundered over, and before I formed the men, Jackson cried out to me to move on at the guns. Colonel Breckenridge started out with what we had over, and I soon got over the 2nd Squadron and moved up the hill. We reached the guns, but they had an infantry support which gave us a volley. At the same time, a battery on our right, which we had not seen, opened on us, and back we had to come. I moved down the swamp about a quarter of a mile and recrossed with great difficulty by a cowpath. The artillery did little better than the cavalry. The ground on the north bank of the swamp by no means favoured the action of the guns. To the right of the road the slopes were clear and unobstructed, but the crest was within the forest, while to the left a thick pine wood covered both ridge and valley. On the bank held by the Federals the ground was open, ascending gently to the ridge, but the edge of the stream, immediately opposite the cleared ground on the Confederate right, was covered by a belt of tall trees in full leaf, which made observation, by either side, a matter of much difficulty. This belt was full of infantry, while to the right rear, commanding the ruined bridge, stood the batteries which had driven back the cavalry. After some time spent in reconnaissance, it was determined to cut a track through the wood to the right of the road. This was done, and 31 guns, moving forward simultaneously ready-shotted, opened fire on the position. The surprise was complete. One of the Federal batteries dispersed in confusion, the other disappeared, and the infantry supports fell back. Jackson immediately ordered 2 guns to advance down the road and shell the belt of trees which harboured the enemy's skirmishers. These were driven back. The divisions of D.H. Hill and Whiting were formed up in the pine wood on the left, and a working party was sent forward to repair the bridge. Suddenly, from the high ground behind the belt of trees, by which they were completely screened, 2 fresh Federal batteries, afterwards increased to 3, opened on the line of Confederate guns. Under cover of this fire, their skirmishers returned to the swamp, and their main line came forward to a position whence it commanded the crossing at effective range. The 2 guns on the road were sent to the right about. The shells of the Federal batteries fell into the stream, and the men who had been labouring at the bridge ran back and refused to work. The artillery duel, in which neither side could see the other, but in which both suffered some loss, continued throughout the afternoon. Meantime, a Confederate regiment, fording the stream, drove in the hostile skirmishers and seized the belt of trees. Wright's brigade, of Huger's division, which had joined Jackson as the guns came into action, was sent back to force a passage at Brackett's Ford, a mile upstream, and reconnaissances were pushed out to find some way of turning the enemy's position. Every road and track, however, was obstructed by felled trees and abatis, and it was found that a passage was impracticable at Brackett's Ford.